springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas.
84 years ago, on October 30, 1938, Orson Welles hoaxed the American people with a radio dramatization of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. Even though there were disclaimers, people in and around Grover's Mill, New Jersey, still called the police to find out what was going on. Some even asked about donating blood. Hello, and welcome to the 2A Infobank, the Second Amendment Society of Texas's podcast. I'm Bill Cawthon, director of the Infobank, and I want to talk to you about an even bigger hoax. I'm talking about the assault weapons ban. From here on out, I'm just going to call it the assault weapons hoax. Using weaponized language and playing on the public's emotions, gun control advocates took ordinary semi-automatic rifles and turned them into a bigger threat than Martians landing in New Jersey. The difference is, there was never an actual panic in 1938. The news stories and headlines were a product of sensationalist newspapers. The basis for the assault weapons hoax is just as fictitious as the War of the Worlds, but it has been used to deliberately create a panic. Wells himself said one of the motivations for the show was, we were fed up with the way in which everything that came over this new box, the radio, was being swallowed. He went on to say, we wanted people to understand that they shouldn't take any opinion predigested, and they shouldn't believe everything they heard that came through the tap, whether it was radio or not. It's amazing how some things never change, isn't it? Sensation-seeking media and an uncritical public are a dangerous mix. Unlike the one-time shot for the War of the Worlds, the assault weapons ban has been going on for decades, and it's all based on appearance and myths. Assault weapon, assault rifle, weapon of war, military grade are all lies. The features they use to condemn rifles like the AR-15 and AK-47 are all cosmetic or ergonomic. Not one of them has anything whatsoever to do with the rifle's functioning. Despite the fact that American hunters, farmers, and ranchers use them for game, pest control, and predator control, gun control advocates in the media proclaim they are useless for hunting and suitable only for killing people. Gun control advocates use memes like, not your grandfather's hunting rifle, to make it appear that rifles such as the AR-15 are relatively new. They count on the general public's lack of knowledge to sell this whopper. Not only do they ignore the fact that Colt introduced the AR-15 Sporter over 60 years ago, they gloss over the fact that semi-automatic rifles, even semi-automatic rifles with large capacity magazines, have been around since the first decade of the last century, and all of those were designed for and marketed to American hunters. The anti-gun faction also ignores the truth about the power of the .223 Remington round, the AR-15 standard cartridge. Compared to other common, non-magnum centerfire rifle cartridges, the .223 is almost the weakest in terms of kinetic energy at the muzzle. Next to the most popular cartridges for Granddad's mythical hunting rifle, the .223 is a pipsqueak with only about half the power. It's only when compared to handgun rounds that the .223 looks potent. It packs 2.6 times the muzzle energy of the 9mm Parabellum, the handgun caliber most commonly used in mass shootings. There's too much here to write it off as ignorance. The facts are readily available, and gun control fans have had years to correct their errors. Nope, this is deliberate deception with malice aforethought. It's all part of gun control's big lie, a strategy described by Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf and employed by Big Brother in George Orwell's 1984. If you're going to lie, make it a big lie and repeat it often. it will gradually become accepted as the truth. Politicians looking for an easy way to look like they are doing something eagerly join in the rabble-rousing. The President of the United States makes claims about the original federal assault weapons ban that are completely untrue. Not only did the ban fail to make a noticeable impact on crime or mass shootings, the supposedly banned guns were used in more mass shootings during the ban than in the 10 years before the ban. According to the FBI, the average annual number of murders committed with all types of rifles combined from 2005 to 2021, after the ban expired, was 29% lower than it was during the ban. This doesn't support the case for a new one, unless, of course, you make sure nobody ever hears it. Looking at the 28-year period from 1994 to 2021, almost twice as many people were murdered by killers using their bare hands and feet as were killed by rifle fire. Hands and feet were far more common assault weapons, not only in homicides but in all categories of violent crime. Looking at the same period, rifles were used in about 2.4% of all murders reported. Hands and feet accounted for 4.8% of the total. It's estimated that Americans own roughly 24.4 million rifles like the AK-47, SRS, AR-10, and AR-15. These are generally lumped together in a category called modern sporting rifles. According to the mass shooting database compiled by Mother Jones, a total of 76 modern sporting rifles have been used in mass shootings since July 18, 1984. The Violence Project's database puts the total at 82 since February 14, 1977. While neither Mother Jones nor the Violence Project are pro-gun, they are at least reasonably objective. Either number out of 24.4 million works out to an absurdly small percentage, yet this is the primary basis for the demand for a new ban. Now we need to look at the monster created by the Ban Brigade. This is perhaps the only part of the relentless campaign that can be attributed to ignorance instead of malice. Prior to the murders at Sandy Hook Elementary School, Eastern Bloc rifles like the AK-47 and SKS were the most frequent choices of mass shooters. AR-15s were used about as often as M1 carbines and Ruger Mini 14 rifles. After the Sandy Hook incident, the patterns changed dramatically. AK rifle usage dropped 30%. Usage of M1 carbines and Ruger Mini 14s disappeared, while AR-15 usage rocketed up 650%. Since there were no functional changes to any of the rifles used, there must be another factor that drove this change. So what happened? The founding of the gun control group Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, the day after the Sandy Hook killings, was certainly a factor. Along with other gun control advocacy organizations, politicians, and the mainstream media, Moms Demand Action put the Armalite rifle in the spotlight, and an entire mythology was created around it, claiming virtually supernatural capabilities that have never been demonstrated in any real firearm over the last 1,000 years. Since it is well established that mass shooters are copycats, inspired by previous killers, and want the almost obsessive media attention showered on them, it was only natural that their preferred weapon quickly became the AR-15. But it wasn't just the switch in firearms. In the 10 years before Sandy Hook, there were 29 mass shootings. In the 10 years afterward, there were 75. To anyone who actually studies the data, it's obvious that the big jump in AR-15 usage and mass shootings was not caused by the rifle itself or by manufacturer marketing. It was caused by the hysteria created by gun control advocates and the media, abetted by publicity-seeking politicians. To divert attention From their own responsibility for the soaring number of shootings and AR-15 usages, the gun control faithful try to blame lawful gun owners and manufacturers. They demand they take ownership of mass shootings, which is frankly ridiculous. Unfortunately, the damage done is much like Pandora's box. Once opened, it cannot be closed. But a new assault weapons ban is not only not the answer, it's really no longer an option. Since the AR-15 meets the standards set by the Supreme Court in United States v. Miller, and both the AR-15 and AK-47, as well as the SKS, meet the standards set by the Supreme Court in District of Columbia v. Heller, and affirmed by the court in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, a new ban is unlikely to withstand a Second Amendment challenge. This is especially true for the AR-15. With millions owned for hunting, competition, and home defense, there's no question that it's in common use for lawful purposes. The Supreme Court has already vacated the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruling in Bianchi v. Frosch, which upheld Maryland's ban. California's ban has been sent back down to the same district judge who declared it unconstitutional 2 years ago. New bans are being challenged as quickly as they are passed. In the end, the Supreme Court will most likely have the final say, the same Supreme Court that affirmed the in common use standard just last year. What is happening right now is essentially a campaign of virtue signaling that will prove enormously expensive to the taxpayers of the United States, as well as the various states that have passed and continue to pass doomed legislation. Tens of millions of dollars will be flushed down the drain in needless litigation because of a hoax. We have the facts. We know the truth. But we can't just rely on the big organizations to get the truth out there where Americans can hear it. We can be in places they aren't, and we have to help them by speaking up as individuals whenever there's an opportunity. Apathy is just as much our enemy as the gun control gang. Now it's time to turn things back over to Will Cawthon, the host of our podcasts.
Will Cawthon here. One of the main missions of the Second Amendment Society of Texas is providing information. Over the years, we have answered thousands of questions. Some are good, some are bad, some are even funny. In every podcast, we will share an actual question and our answer. Today's question is, what were the cowboys' guns in the Old West? When we think of the Old West, we're usually thinking about the last quarter of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century. The 19th century probably saw more innovation in firearm technology than any other similar period since the fire lance appeared in China in the 10th century. Starting with handmade, one-at-a-time flintlocks, the 19th century saw the invention or introduction of interchangeable parts, allowing mass production, the percussion cap, practical revolvers, double-action revolvers, semi-automatic pistols, bolt-action, lever-action, and semi-automatic rifles, smokeless gunpowder, pump-action shotguns, metallic cartridges, and true machine guns. The most prevalent firearms in the Old West were rifles. Not surprising, since they were the most prevalent firearms everywhere else. Rifles were more useful for hunting and other applications. There were still lots of muzzle-loading muskets and rifles, including flintlocks, that had been converted to use percussion caps, but after the Civil War and the Indian Wars, a lot of newer guns were being brought back after military service. Along with muzzle-loading Springfields and Enfields, there were breech-loading Sharps, Spencer repeating rifles and carbines, and even a small number of Henry lever-action rifles. The Sharps was really a very good rifle. It was very popular with buffalo hunters. During the 1874 Second Battle of Adobe Walls, now a ghost town northeast of Amarillo, Texas, Billy Dixon, a civilian who scouted for the Army, shot a Native American warrior off his horse at more than 1,500 yards with a Sharps chambered for the 50-90 cartridge. Even after 150 years, that's still one of the top 20 confirmed long-range sniper kills in Western history. Winchester lever actions had been around since 1866, but couldn't handle the more powerful rounds used in rifles like the Sharps. It wasn't until 1876 that Winchester fielded the kind of rifle we're used to seeing in the movies. But the actual rifle we associate most often with the Old West didn't appear until 1894. Shotguns were also very common. Most often, these were break-action, single-barrel, or side-by-side double-barreled guns, like the coach guns seen in the westerns. Shotgun shells with paper holes appeared around 1870. The Winchester Model 1897 was the first commercially successful pump shotgun. An evolution of a shotgun developed by John M. Browning in 1893, one of the 1897's advantages was that it was designed to withstand the pressure generated by smokeless gunpowder. A lot of the shotguns owned by Americans back then had weaker breeches and Damascus barrels that couldn't handle the forces. Handguns were comparatively expensive and not as versatile as a rifle. Most people who had them had a reason to own one, or had gotten a freebie from Uncle Sam or the CSA. There were lots of Colt and Remington percussion cap revolvers liberated from military sources by soldiers returning to civilian life, but the truth is that almost every type of revolver known, including the LeMat, which was used by Confederate officers, could be found in pockets, waistbands, or holsters. Incidentally, holsters weren't nearly as common as Hollywood would have you believe, and those fancy quick-draw rigs are pure fiction. A holster meant a belt was needed, and most men didn't wear belts. Belt loops on men's trousers first appeared on garb like baseball uniforms a few years before the Civil War, but they didn't become mainstream until the 1920s. The gun we most often associate with the Wild West is the Colt Model 1873 Single Action Army, or Peacemaker, but it was actually fairly late on the scene. Sam Colt turned down the patents on the bored-through cylinder and metallic cartridge even though it was developed by one of his employees, Rollin White. Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson worked a deal with White, paying him a royalty of 25 cents for each revolver they produced. The Smith & Wesson Model 1 was the first American commercial handgun designed specifically for metallic cartridges. Colt had to wait until the White patents expired in 1869 to produce its own cartridge-loading revolver, the Model 1873. Smith & Wesson made the big time with the Model 3, a .44 caliber revolver that was adopted not only by the U.S. Army but the Russian Imperial Army as well. Wyatt Earp was carrying the Smith & Wesson Model 3 and .44 American caliber at the OK Corral. By the way, Earp carried his revolver in a coat pocket, and the Buntline Special is a myth. Colt did make a Buntline Special, but not until 1955. In 1899, Colt introduced the appropriately named Model 1889, the first modern double-action revolver with a swing-out cylinder. It was sold to the civilian market as the Colt New Army and Navy. Smith & Wesson followed with their own double-action revolver in 1896, the hand injector, Model 1896, and 3 years later introduced the legendary Model 1899, which went on to become the military and police, and is still produced today as the Model 10. You don't see them in movies, but these guns also made it to the Wild West, as did some early semi-automatic rifles and handguns. As long as this answer already is, we're leaving out Ivor Johnson's safety automatic, which was actually a revolver introduced in 1894, Winchester's Model 1903 semi-automatic rifle, and so much more. In short, there was an incredible variety of guns in the Wild West, from converted flintlock rifles and pepperbox pistols to guns that are still produced today. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with another informative podcast. In the meantime, be sure to visit 2ASociety.org and become a subscriber. While you're there, check out our merchandise. We've got stuff sure to upset your local gun grabbers, and we've got the facts to back it up.